Hi, I'm Mia Sullivan, and I never imagined a routine hospital visit would turn into the most shocking day of my life. My father suddenly yelled, "You're not my daughter!" My heart sank, my hands shook, and I could feel everyone in the room staring. I froze, unsure what to do, but then the hospital nurse stepped forward and handed me a document with his signature. The room went silent, and I couldn't believe what I was seeing. The fluorescent lights above buzzed faintly as I stood frozen near his bed. My father's words still echoed in my chest, sharp and unfamiliar. His eyes, once so warm, looked through me like I was a stranger. I wanted to speak, to remind him who I was, but my throat had closed. Behind me, I heard footsteps, and the nurse appeared beside me, holding a manila folder with quiet purpose in her hands. She didn't say much at first. She simply opened the folder and placed a single document on the bedside table. I saw my father's signature at the bottom, unmistakable, the same slanted handwriting I'd seen on birthday cards and permission slips my whole life. The paper was dated 18 months ago, when his mind was still sharp, still his. He had signed me as his sole healthcare proxy. He had chosen me. My father turned his head toward the window, his breathing shallow. The nurse touched my arm gently and whispered that this happens sometimes. Patients with his condition often forgot faces, even the ones they loved most. She said it wasn't rejection. It was illness. But knowing that didn't make his words hurt less. I looked at the signature again, trying to let it anchor. I remembered the day he signed that document. We sat at his kitchen table, coffee between us, sunlight warming the room. He had laughed when I asked if he was sure. He said there was no one else he trusted more. I didn't realize then how much I would need to remember that moment. I didn't know his mind would start slipping away, slowly at first, then faster than I could follow. Growing up, my father wasn't the affectionate type. He showed love through actions, not words. He fixed my bicycle when it broke, drove hours to my college graduation, sat silently beside me when my first relationship ended. I never doubted he cared, even when he didn't say it. But now, watching him stare blankly out the window, I wondered if those memories still existed somewhere inside him. The nurse stepped out quietly, leaving us alone. I pulled a chair close to his bed and sat down, unsure what to say. He didn't look at me. His hands rested on the blanket, still and pale. I reached out and placed my fingers over his. He didn't pull away, but he didn't respond either. I stayed there anyway, hoping something in him might remember. My mother passed when I was 12. After that, it was just the two of us. We learned how to live in silence, how to grieve without falling apart. He never remarried, never even dated. I used to think he was lonely, but now I wonder if he simply didn't have room for anyone else. His heart was full of memories, and maybe that was enough for him. When he first started forgetting things, I told myself it was normal. Misplaced keys, repeated questions, small lapses that anyone might have. But then he forgot to pay bills, forgot appointments, forgot the names of neighbors he'd known for decades. I took him to the doctor, and the diagnosis came quietly, like a door closing. Alzheimer's, early stage. The words felt heavier than anything I had ever carried. I moved back to my hometown to be closer to him. I rented a small apartment 10 minutes from his house. Every morning I stopped by to check on him, make breakfast, remind him of the day. Some mornings he smiled and called me sweetheart. Other mornings he asked who I was. I learned to live in that uncertainty, never knowing which version of him I would meet when I walked through the door. There were good days too. Days when he told stories from his childhood, laughing like nothing was wrong. Days when he remembered my mother's voice, her favorite songs, the way she hummed while cooking. Those moments felt like gifts, small glimpses of the man he used to be. I held on to them tightly, knowing they would grow rarer with time. The hospital visit wasn't planned. He had fallen at home, confused and disoriented. A neighbor found him on the kitchen floor and called an ambulance. By the time I arrived, he was already agitated, scared, convinced that everyone around him was a stranger. That's when he looked at me and shouted those words, words that cut deeper than I expected. I kept staring at the document, reading the words again and again. Healthcare proxy, power of attorney, emergency contact. Every line was proof that he had trusted me when his mind was clear. He had written my name, signed his own, and handed me the responsibility of caring for. I had accepted it without hesitation, not knowing how hard it would become. The nurse returned with a cup of water. She handed it to me and sat on the edge of the chair nearby. She told me she had seen families go through this before. She said the anger, the confusion, the forgetting, none of it was personal. The disease stole memories, rewired connections, and left people stranded in unfamiliar versions of themselves. She said my father was still in there somewhere, even if he couldn't always find his way back. I asked her if he would ever remember me again. She paused before answering. She said some patients had moments of clarity, sudden flashes where everything returned. Others didn't. There was no way to predict it. But she believed that love left traces even when the mind couldn't name them. She believed he'd still felt something when I was near, even if he couldn't explain it. My father turned his head and looked at me. His expression was softer now, less afraid. He didn't say my name, but he didn't look away either. I smiled at him, hoping he could feel something familiar in my face. He blinked slowly, then closed his eyes. I watched his chest rise and fall, and I stayed beside him, unwilling to leave him alone in that sterile room. I thought about the house I grew up in, still standing on the same quiet. My father had lived there for over 40 years. Every corner held a memory. The hallway where I learned to walk. The backyard where he taught me to ride a bike. The kitchen where we ate dinner in comfortable silence. I wondered what would happen to that house if he never returned to it. There were decisions I would have to make soon. Medical decisions, financial decisions, choices I never imagined facing at 34. The document gave me the authority, but it didn't give me the answers. I would have to figure those out on my own, carrying the weight of his trust without knowing if I was doing the right thing. A memory surfaced, unbidden. I was 16, sitting in his truck after a fight with a friend. I was crying, embarrassed, trying to hide my face. He didn't say anything. He just drove us to the lake and parked near the water. We sat there for an hour watching the sun set, until I felt calm again. He never asked what happened. He just stayed. That was his way. Presence over words. Patience over advice. I had inherited some of that from him, I realized. I wasn't good at talking about feelings either. But I was good at showing up. I was good at staying, even when things got hard. Maybe that was the best thing I could offer him now. I looked at his sleeping face and felt a strange mix of grief and gratitude. Grief for the father I was slowly, gratitude for the years we had shared, imperfect and quiet as they were. I didn't know how much time we had left together, but I knew I would spend it showing up. That was my promise, unspoken but absolute. The nurse came by once more to check his vitals. She said he would likely sleep through the night. She encouraged me to go home and rest, to take care of myself too. I nodded but didn't move. I wasn't ready to leave yet. I wanted to stay a little longer, watching over him the way he once watched over me. Outside the window, the sky had turned dark. The hospital sounds faded into a low hum, machines beeping softly, footsteps echoing in the hall. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes, still holding his hand. I thought about the document, his signature, the choice he made when he still could. He had chosen me. That meant something. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring. Maybe he would wake up and remember my name. Maybe he wouldn't. Either way, I would be there. I would bring him coffee, tell him stories, play his favorite music. I would remind him of the life we shared, even if the memories lived only in me now. Before I left, I tucked the blanket around his shoulders and kissed his forehead. He stirred slightly, but didn't wake. I whispered that I loved him, not knowing if he could hear. Then I picked up the document, folded it carefully, and placed it in my bag. It was proof of something words could no longer express. Walking out of the hospital, I felt the cool night air on my face. My heart was heavy, but not broken. Somewhere between his outburst and his peaceful sleep, I had found something I didn't expect. Not answers, but clarity. I was his daughter, not because he remembered, but because I chose to stay. And that was enough. The drive home felt longer than usual. Streetlights blurred past my window, and I kept replaying his voice in my head. "You're not my daughter." I knew it was the disease talking, but the words still echoed. I pulled into my apartment complex and sat in the car for a while, staring at nothing. The document was in my bag, folded and waiting, a quiet reminder of who I was to him. I didn't sleep much that night. I lay in bed watching the ceiling, thinking about the decisions ahead. His house, his bills, his care, all of it now rested on my shoulders. I had accepted that responsibility willingly, but I hadn't expected it to feel so heavy. Every choice felt permanent, like carving something into stone that couldn't be undone. The next morning, I returned to the hospital with coffee and a change of clothes. He was awake when I arrived, sitting up slightly, staring at the wall. I said good morning, and he turned his head slowly. His eyes searched my face, confused but curious. He didn't call me by name, but he didn't look afraid either. That felt like progress. I sat beside him and told him about the weather outside. Sunny, a little cold, the kind of day he used to love for yard work. He listened quietly, nodding sometimes, though I wasn't sure he understood. I kept talking anyway, filling the silence with ordinary things. It felt better than sitting in the weight of what we couldn't say to each other anymore. The nurse came by to check his vitals. She smiled at me warmly and said he had eaten breakfast, which was a good sign. I thanked her and watched as she adjusted his fore. My father's eyes followed her movements, trusting and calm. It struck me how much he depended on strangers now, people whose names he would never remember, caring for him in ways I couldn't. Later that afternoon, my phone buzzed. It was my Aunt Linda, my father's younger sister. She lived 3 hours away and hadn't visited in months. Her voice was tight when I answered, already defensive before I had said anything. She asked why no one had called her about his fall. I explained it happened quickly, that I had been focused on him, not on making phone calls. She didn't accept that. She said she had a right to know, that he was her brother, that I was shutting her out. I felt my chest tighten but kept my voice steady. I told her she was welcome to visit any time. I told her I wasn't trying to keep anyone away, but I could hear the accusation underneath her words, and it stung more than I wanted to. After we hung up, I sat in the hospital hallway and stared at my phone. Linda and I had never been close. She had opinions about everything, how I lived, how I cared for my father, how I handled my mother's death. She meant well, I think, but her help always came wrapped in criticism. I wasn't sure I had the energy to manage her feelings on top of everything. My father was asleep when I returned to his room. I watched him breathe, slow and even, and thought about what Linda had said. Maybe she was right to be upset. Maybe I had shut people out without realizing. Caring for him had become my entire world, and I hadn't left much room for anyone. I wondered if that was protection or just loneliness wearing a different mask. The next few days passed in a quiet rhythm. I visited every morning, stayed through lunch, went home to rest, and returned in the evening. Sometimes he recognized me. Sometimes he didn't. I learned to stop expecting consistency and just be grateful for the moments when his eyes softened and he reached for my hand without being asked. Linda called again midweek. She said she was coming to visit that weekend, and her tone made it clear it wasn't a request. I said okay, trying to sound welcoming. Part of me dreaded it, but another part felt relieved. Maybe she would see how hard this was. Maybe she would finally understand why I hadn't called, why I had been too exhausted to explain. I spent the rest of the week preparing, cleaning my apartment, organizing his medical paperwork, rehearsing what I would say. I wanted her to see that I was handling things, that I wasn't failing him. But underneath that desire was something more fragile. I wanted her to tell me I was doing a good job. I wanted someone to say it out loud. Saturday came faster than I expected. Linda arrived at the hospital just before noon, her coat still buttoned, her face unreadable. She hugged me briefly, then walked straight to his bedside. He looked at her with the same blank expression he sometimes gave me. She said his name, touched his cheek, waited for recognition. It didn't come. She sat down heavily in the chair beside him. I watched her shoulders drop, watched the hope drain from her posture. She had expected something different, I realized. She had imagined he would remember her, that his forgetting was reserved for me. But the disease didn't play favorites. It took pieces of everyone, slowly and without mercy. We didn't talk much at first. She asked questions about his treatment, his medications, his prognosis. I answered as clearly as I could, showing her the documents, explaining what the doctors had said. She listened, nodding occasionally, but I could see her struggling. This wasn't the brother she remembered. This was someone else, someone she didn't know how to reach. Later, we walked to the hospital cafeteria and sat across from each other with lukewarm coffee. She apologized for the phone call, said she had been scared and reacted badly. I told her I understood, and I meant it. Fear made people say things they didn't mean. I had learned that lesson watching my father shout words he would never have spoken before. She asked how I was really doing. Not the surface answer, but the truth underneath. I hesitated, unsure how much to share. Then I told her I was tired. I told her I woke up every morning not knowing what version of him I would find. I told her I loved him and hated this disease, and didn't know how much longer I could carry it alone. She reached across the table and held my hand. She said I wasn't alone anymore. She said she would help however she could, visiting more often, making calls, handling paperwork. I didn't know if she would keep that promise, but hearing it mattered. Sometimes the offer itself is a kind of gift, even if it never fully arrives. We returned to his room together. He was awake again, watching the sunlight shift across the wall. Linda sat beside him and started talking about their childhood, stories I had never heard. A treehouse their father built, a dog named Chester, summer nights catching fireflies. His expression didn't change, but I liked to think something inside him was listening. I stepped into the hallway to give them space. Through the window, I could see her holding his hand, still talking, still hoping. I felt a strange mixture of jealousy and gratitude. Jealous that she could share memories I would never have. Grateful that someone else was here, carrying a small piece of this weight beside me. That evening, Linda drove back home. She hugged me longer this time, tighter. She said she would call tomorrow, and I believed her. Watching her car disappear down the street, I felt something shift inside me. I had been so focused on doing this alone that I forgot I didn't have to. Asking for help wasn't weakness. It was survival. The next morning, I brought my father his favorite music. Old jazz records he used to play on Sunday mornings while making pancakes. I held my phone near his ear and watched his face. For a moment something flickered, a softness, a memory, a feeling he couldn't name. He closed his eyes and listened, and I stayed perfectly still, afraid to break the spell. When the song ended, he opened his eyes and looked at me. He didn't say my name, but he smiled, just slightly, just enough. I smiled back, holding his gaze, letting the moment stretch. It wasn't recognition, not exactly, but it was something. Connection without language, love without memory, a bridge built from feeling alone. I thought about Linda's visit, about the stories she had shared. I realized there was so much about my father I still didn't know, so much history locked inside a mind that was slowly closing its doors. I wanted to gather every story I could from anyone who remembered, before it was too late. His life deserved to be preserved, even if he couldn't tell it himself. Driving home that night, I made a decision. I would start recording everything, his stories, Linda's memories, photos, and letters, and anything else I could find. I would build an archive of who he was, not for him, but for me, so that when the forgetting was complete, I would still have something to hold. Something that proved he had lived and loved and mattered. I started with the photo albums. They were stacked in my father's closet, dusty and untouched for years. I carried them to his kitchen table and opened the first one slowly. The pictures were faded, edges curling, but the faces were clear. My mother, young and laughing. My father, proud and shy. Me, small and unaware that life would ever become this complicated. I didn't recognize some of the people in the older photos. Friends from before I was, relatives who had passed away, neighbors from houses long since sold. I made a list of questions to ask Linda next time we spoke. She would know the names, the stories, the context I was missing. Every picture felt like a locked door, and I needed someone to help me find the keys. Linda called that weekend just like she promised. Her voice was softer now, less guarded. She asked about our father, and I told her he was stable, sleeping more, eating less. She listened without interrupting, then offered to come again the following month. I said yes without hesitation. Having her there had helped more than I expected, and I wasn't too proud to admit it anymore. I asked her about the photos. She laughed and said she hadn't seen those albums in decades. I described a few pictures: a woman in a yellow dress, a man holding a fishing rod, a group gathered around a birthday cake. She recognized most of them and promised to write down what she remembered. Her voice caught slightly when she mentioned their mother. Some memories, I realized, were painful for everyone. The following week, I brought one of the albums to the hospital. I sat beside my father and turned the pages slowly, narrating each image. He watched with quiet interest, though I couldn't tell if he recognized it. When I showed him a picture of my mother on their wedding day, he touched the page gently. He didn't say her name, but his fingers lingered there, tracing the outline of her face. I wondered what he saw when he looked at her. Did he remember the sound of her voice, the way she laughed, the warmth of her presence? Or was she just a beautiful stranger frozen in time, someone his heart remembered even when his mind could not? I wanted to ask him, but I was afraid of the answer. Some questions are better left unspoken. That night, I started writing. Not a formal journal, just scattered notes about the things I wanted to remember. The way he used to whistle while fixing things around the house. The smell of his coffee in the morning. The quiet pride in his eyes when I graduated college. I wrote until my hand ached, filling pages with fragments of a life that was slowly slipping away from both of us. Linda sent me a letter the following week. Inside were handwritten pages filled with stories, their childhood adventures, their parents' quirks, the small town where they grew up. She included a few old photographs I had never seen before. One showed my father as a teenager, skinny and serious, standing beside a car he had saved months to buy. I stared at it for a long time, trying to see the man I knew inside that unfamiliar boy. I visited him every day that week, bringing new photos, new stories, new pieces of the past. Sometimes he seemed engaged, leaning forward slightly, eyes focused on the images. Other times he drifted away mid-sentence, lost in thoughts I couldn't follow. I learned to accept both versions without disappointment. Showing up was the point, not the outcome. One afternoon, something unexpected happened. I was reading aloud from Linda's letter, describing a prank they played on a neighbor as kids. My father laughed. Not a polite chuckle, but a real laugh, deep and surprised, like the sound had escaped without permission. I stopped reading and stared at him. He looked back at me, still smiling, and for one bright moment, he was completely himself. The moment passed quickly. His smile faded, replaced by confusion, and he asked where he was. I told him gently, and he nodded, accepting the answer without fully understanding it. But I held on to that laugh like a treasure. It proved he was still in there somewhere, buried beneath the fog, waiting for the right memory to bring him back. I told Linda about it during our next phone call. She cried, quietly, and I could hear her wiping her eyes on the other end. She said she wished she had been there to see it. I promised to keep trying, to keep reading the stories, to keep searching for the moments that might reach him. She thanked me, and for the first time, I felt like we were truly working together. The doctor said his condition was progressing, slowly but steadily. They adjusted his medications and recommended increasing his care hours. I nodded and signed the forms, feeling the weight of each decision. There was no guidebook for this, no clear path forward. I was navigating by instinct, hoping I was making the choices he would have wanted. I started bringing music again, different songs, each visit. Sometimes jazz, sometimes country, sometimes the old hymns his mother used to sing. He responded to the hymns most strongly, humming along without knowing the words. I recorded one of those moments on my phone and watched it later that night, tears streaming down my face. His voice was fragile but beautiful, a thread connecting him to something ancient and true. Linda visited again at the end of the month. She brought a box of old letters, correspondence between their parents, notes passed between siblings, postcards from long-forgotten vacations. We spent hours reading them together, laughing at the old-fashioned language, marveling at how different life had been. My father sat nearby, sometimes listening, sometimes sleeping, always present in his own quiet way. One letter stood out. It was from my grandmother to my grandfather, written during the war, full of longing and hope. She described waiting for his return, imagining their future together, trusting that love would survive the distance. I read it aloud, and when I looked up, my father's eyes were. He didn't speak, but something in his expression told me he understood. That evening, Linda and I sat on the porch of my apartment, drinking wine and watching the stars. She talked about regrets, years she had wasted being distant, arguments she wished she could take back. I listened without judgment. We had all made mistakes. The only thing that mattered now was showing up, again and again, until there was no more time left. She asked if I ever thought about what would happen after. I knew what she meant, though neither of us wanted to say the word. I told her I tried not to think too far ahead. I told her I was focused on today, on this visit, on the next small moment of connection. Planning for grief felt like giving up, and I wasn't ready for that yet. Before she left, she handed me a small envelope. Inside was a photograph of my father and mother taken before I was born. They were standing on a beach, barefoot and happy, waves crashing behind them. On the back, in my mother's handwriting, were the words, "The beginning of everything." I pressed the photo to my chest and thanked her without being able to say more. The next morning, I brought the beach photo to my father. I held it in front of him and watched his face carefully. He stared at it for a long time, longer than usual. Then he looked at me and said very quietly, "She was beautiful." I nodded, unable to speak. He remembered her. In that moment, across all the fog and confusion, he remembered. I asked if he remembered the day the photo was taken. He shook his head slowly, but he kept looking at the image. He said he remembered the feeling, even if the details were gone. He said being with her felt like coming home. I wrote those words down later, wanting to preserve them exactly as he said them. Some sentences deserve to live forever. That week, I started organizing everything. The photos, the letters, the recordings, the notes. I bought a scrapbook and began arranging them chronologically, creating a story of his life from beginning to. It wasn't complete, and it never would be. But it was something tangible, something I could hold when holding him was no longer possible. Linda offered to help with the scrapbook during her next visit. She said she wanted to add her own memories, her own perspective. I agreed immediately. This project had started as mine, but it was becoming ours, a shared act of love built from fragments and feelings. My father's life was bigger than any one person's memory, and it deserved to be honored that way. I visited him the night before Linda arrived. He was calm, resting peacefully, the photo of my mother placed on his bedside table. I held his hand and told him about the scrapbook, about all the people who loved him, about the legacy he was leaving behind. He listened with closed eyes, breathing softly. I liked to believe he heard me, even in his sleep. Walking to my car, I looked up at the hospital windows, imagining him inside, dreaming of beaches and music and the woman he had loved. I didn't know how many more visits we would have, but I knew each one mattered. Each one added something to the story we were building together. And that was enough to keep me coming back. Linda arrived on a Thursday afternoon, carrying a suitcase and a box of old home videos she had found in her attic. I hadn't seen those tapes in years. We set up an old player in my apartment and watched together, the screen flickering with memories. There was my father, young and strong, pushing me on a swing. There was my mother, waving at the camera, alive and laughing. I had forgotten how much I missed her voice. We watched for hours, pausing sometimes to cry, sometimes to laugh. Linda pointed out details I had missed. The way my father looked at my mother, the way he held me, like I was the most precious thing in the world. I had been too young to notice back then. Now, watching through adult eyes, I saw everything differently. I saw a man who loved, even when he didn't say it. The next morning, we brought the scrapbook to the hospital. My father was awake, sitting up slightly, watching the door as if expecting someone. When he saw Linda, his face changed. Not recognition exactly, but something close, a warmth, a comfort. He reached out his hand and she took it without hesitation. I stood back and let them have their moment together. Linda showed him the scrapbook page by page. She narrated each photo, each letter, each memory. He listened with unusual focus, nodding sometimes, touching the images with trembling fingers. When she reached the wedding photo of our parents, he said my mother's name, clear and certain, like he had never forgotten. Linda looked at me, eyes wide, and I felt something break open inside my chest. He talked for almost 20 minutes after that. Fragments, mostly. Scattered memories that didn't connect, names without context, feelings without stories. But he was present in a way I hadn't seen in months. Linda held his hand the entire time, encouraging him gently, never rushing. I recorded everything on my phone, wanting to capture every word before it disappeared again. When he finally grew tired, we stepped into the hallway. Linda was shaking slightly, overwhelmed by what had just happened. She said she hadn't expected that, hadn't dared to hope. I told her I understood. Hope was dangerous in situations like this. It opened you up to disappointment, made the bad days feel even worse. But it also made the good days feel like miracles. That evening, we added new pages to the scrapbook, and we wrote down everything he had said, every name he mentioned, every fragment of memory. It wasn't much, but it was something. A record of a moment when he had come back to us, even briefly. I placed the pages carefully between the older photos, weaving past and present together. Linda stayed for 5 days. We fell into a comfortable routine, mornings at the hospital, afternoons working on the scrapbook, evenings talking on my porch. She told me stories about their childhood I had never heard before. The time he defended her from a bully. The summer they spent building a treehouse that collapsed the first week. The quiet way he grieved when their father died. I realized I had only known one version of him. The father, the widower, the aging man losing his memory. But he had been so many other things before I existed. A brother, a son, a teenager with dreams and fears. Linda helped me see those layers, helped me understand that his life was rich and full long before I became part of it. The day she left, we stood in the hospital parking lot, neither of us wanting to say goodbye. She promised to come back soon, to keep sending letters and photos, to call every week. I believed her this time. Something had shifted between us during her visit. We weren't just connected by blood anymore. We were connected by purpose, by love, by the shared work of remembering. After she drove away, I returned to my father's room. He was sleeping peacefully, the scrapbook resting on his bedside table. I sat beside him and opened it to a random page. A photo of him holding me as a baby, both of us squinting in the sunlight. I didn't remember that moment, but I felt it somehow. A warmth that transcended memory, passed down through touch, and the following week was quieter. He slept more, talked less, drifted further into the fog. The doctors said this was expected, part of the progression. I nodded and signed more forms, adjusted more care schedules, made more decisions I wasn't sure about. Each choice felt like a small surrender, an acceptance of something I still wasn't ready to accept. I brought the scrapbook every visit, even when he couldn't engage with it. I read the letters aloud, described the photos, played the music he loved. Sometimes his eyes flickered with something, recognition or comfort, I couldn't tell which, but I kept going anyway. The ritual mattered more than the response. Showing up mattered more than being seen. One evening, a young nurse I hadn't met before stopped me in the hallway. She said she had heard me reading to him through the door. She said it was beautiful. The way I cared for him. The way I refused to give up. I thanked her quietly, unsure how to respond. I didn't feel beautiful. I felt exhausted, scared, and completely unsure if I was doing any of this right. She told me about her own grandmother, who had passed from the same disease 3 years ago. She said the hardest part wasn't the forgetting. It was the guilt, wondering if she had done enough, said enough, been present enough. She said that guilt never fully disappeared, but it softened over time. I listened carefully, recognizing my own fears in her. That night, I wrote a letter to my father. Not to give him he couldn't read anymore, but for myself. I wrote about everything I wished I had said when his mind was clear. I wrote about gratitude, about regret, about the complicated love between parents and children. I wrote until the words ran out, then folded the paper and tucked it into the scrapbook. Linda called the next morning. She had found more photographs, this time from a family reunion in the 80s. She described them excitedly: cousins I had never met, great aunts whose names I barely recognized, a picnic table overflowing with food and laughter. She promised to send copies, and I promised to add them to the scrapbook. Our project was growing, becoming something larger than either of us had planned. I asked her if she ever felt guilty about the years of distance, the arguments, the missed visits. She was quiet for a moment, then admitted she did. Every day. But she said guilt was just love with nowhere to go. The only cure was action, showing up, making amends, doing the work even when it was too late to fix everything. I wrote that phrase down after we hung up. Love with nowhere to go. The next time I visited, my father was more alert than he had been in weeks. He was sitting up when I arrived, looking toward the window with unusual focus. I sat beside him and asked what he was thinking about. He turned to me slowly, studied my face, and said something that stopped my heart. He said I looked like someone he used to know, someone he loved very much. I asked who. He paused, searching for the word, the name, the memory. Then he said my mother's name. He said I had her eyes, her smile, her way of tilting my head when I listened. I couldn't speak. I just nodded, tears streaming down my face, overwhelmed by the weight of being seen. Even through the fog, he could still find pieces of her in me. He fell asleep shortly after, but I stayed for hours, watching him breathe, replaying his words in my mind. I had always known I resembled my mother, but hearing him say it felt different. It felt like a gift, a bridge across the distance his disease had created. In that moment, he wasn't just my father. He was a man who had loved a woman and could still see her face in mine. I called Linda that night and told her what happened. She cried with me, then laughed through her tears. She said our mother would have loved knowing that, would have been so proud of the woman I had become. I hadn't thought of it that way before. That caring for him was also honoring her, that the love I gave him was an extension of the love she had started. The next morning, I added a new page to the scrapbook. I wrote down his exact words, dated and preserved, a moment I never wanted to forget. I placed it next to the beach photo, the one with my mother's handwriting on the back. 2 moments of recognition, separated by decades, connected by love. The scrapbook was becoming a map of our family's heart. I spent the rest of the week in a strange kind of peace. The fear was still there, the exhaustion, the grief that lived just beneath the surface. But something had shifted. I was no longer just enduring this journey. I was finding meaning in it, purpose in the small moments, beauty in the fragments that remained. My father was still here, still reachable, and I was still his daughter. Walking out of the hospital that Friday evening, I paused and looked back at his window. The light was soft, golden, falling across the glass like a blessing. I didn't know how much time we had left together, but I knew I would spend it well. I would keep showing up, keep reading, keep remembering. That was all I could do, and somehow, it felt like enough. The call came on a Sunday morning. I was making coffee when my phone buzzed, and I knew before answering what it meant. The nurse spoke gently, saying he had passed peacefully in his sleep, no pain, no struggle. I thanked her and hung up, then stood in my kitchen for a long time, watching the steam rise from my untouched cup. The silence felt different now. Heavier, but also strangely still. I called Linda first. She answered on the second ring, and I didn't have to say much. She heard it in my voice in the pause before I spoke. She said she would drive down immediately, that I shouldn't be alone. I told her I was okay, but she insisted. 3 hours later, she was at my door, pulling me into a hug that lasted longer than any words could have. We drove to the hospital together. His room was quiet when we arrived, the machines turned off, the bed empty except for the indent where his body had rested. I stood in the doorway, unable to move forward. Linda took my hand and guided me inside. We sat in the chairs where we had spent so many hours, staring at the space where he used to be. The scrapbook was still on the bedside table. I picked it up and held it against my chest, feeling the weight of everything it contained. All those photos, letters, memories. They were mine now. His story had ended, but the record remained. I thought about how hard we had worked to preserve it, and I was grateful we had started before it was too late. Linda asked if I wanted to see him one more. The hospital had arranged for us to say goodbye before they moved. I hesitated, afraid of what I might feel, what I might see, but I nodded yes. I needed closure, needed to look at his face one last time and know that his suffering was over, that he was finally at peace. He looked smaller than I remembered, quieter, somehow, as if the stillness had settled into his bones. His face was relaxed, free from the confusion that had clouded his final months. I touched his hand, cold now, but still familiar, and whispered that I loved him. I told him I hoped he was with Mom again, wherever that might be. I hoped he had found his way home. Linda stood beside me, crying softly. She said a prayer I didn't recognize, words from their childhood church, rhythms that felt ancient and comforting. I closed my eyes and listened, letting the sounds wash over me. I wasn't sure what I believed about death, about what came after, but I believed in love, and I believed he had known he was loved until the very end. We stayed for almost an hour, talking to him, talking to each other, sharing memories that surfaced unbidden. The time he taught me to drive in an empty parking lot, the way he hummed while reading the newspaper, his habit of falling asleep in his recliner every Sunday afternoon. Small things, ordinary things, the details that made a life feel real and whole. The funeral was held the following Saturday. It was small, just family, and a few old friends who remembered him from before the disease. Linda and I had planned it together, choosing readings and music that reflected who he was. We played the jazz he loved, read passages from letters he had written to our mother. It felt honest, personal, like something he would have approved of. I gave a eulogy, though I wasn't sure I could get through it. I talked about his quiet strength, his steady presence, the way he showed love through actions rather than words. I talked about the scrapbook, about the months we had spent preserving his memories. I said that grief was just love with nowhere to go, and that I would carry his love with me for the rest of my life. Afterward, people I barely knew approached me with condolence. They shared stories I had never heard, moments of kindness, small gestures, ways he had touched their lives without ever mentioning it. A neighbor he helped fix a roof. A coworker he lent money to during a hard time. A stranger he once drove to the hospital when their car broke down. I listened to each story like a gift. Linda and I went to his house that evening. It was strange, walking through the rooms without expecting to find him there. Everything looked the same, his recliner, his books, the coffee mug still sitting by the sink. But the absence was everywhere, filling every corner, making the familiar feel foreign. I sat on the couch and cried, finally letting out everything I had held inside. She sat beside me without speaking, just being present, letting me grieve without trying to fix it. When I finally calmed down, she made us tea and we talked about practical things. What to do with the house, how to handle his belongings, which items to keep, and which to donate. It felt too soon to make those decisions, but I knew they couldn't wait forever. We agreed to take our time. There was no rush, no deadline. We would sort through his things slowly, honoring each object before letting it go. I wanted to keep the recliner, the photo albums, the letters from our mother. Linda wanted his fishing gear, his old records, the watch their father had given him. We divided things with care, making sure nothing felt like loss. The weeks that followed were harder than I expected. Grief didn't arrive all at once. It came in waves, unexpected and overwhelming. I would be fine for days, then suddenly break down while washing dishes or driving to work. I learned to let the waves come, to ride them without fighting. Resisting only made it worse. Acceptance, I discovered, was the only way through. I returned to his house often, even after we started clearing it out. I would sit in his recliner and close my eyes, imagining I could still hear him breathing nearby. Sometimes I talked to him, telling him about my day, asking questions I knew he couldn't answer. It probably seemed strange, but it helped. It kept the connection alive, even after he was gone. Linda called every week, sometimes more. Our relationship had transformed during those final months. She'd become more than an aunt. She was a partner, a witness, someone who understood exactly what I had lost. We talked about him constantly, sharing memories, keeping his story alive through repetition. I realized that remembering wasn't just about the past. It was a way of carrying someone forward. Spring arrived slowly, softening the edges of I started taking walks again, noticing things I had ignored during the long winter of caregiving. Flowers blooming in neighbors' yards, children laughing on their way to school, the smell of fresh rain on warm pavement. The world was still turning, still beautiful, still worth being present for. I had almost forgotten that. I finished the scrapbook on the anniversary of his diagnosis. The final pages included photos from the funeral, copies of the eulogy, and a letter I had written to him that I never got to read aloud. I placed it on my bookshelf, where I could see it every day. It wasn't just a record of his life anymore. It was a record of ours, the journey we had taken together, however painful it had been. One afternoon, I visited his grave for the first time since the burial. I brought flowers and the beach photo of him and my mother. I sat on the grass and talked to them both, telling them about the scrapbook, about Linda, about all the ways I was learning to live without them. A breeze stirred the trees above me, and I chose to believe they were listening. I thought about everything he had taught me without saying a word. How to show up, even when it's hard. How to love through actions, not just words. How to stay present, even when the future feels uncertain. He had given me those lessons not through lectures, but through example, and now it was my turn to pass them on. Linda visited again that summer. We spent a weekend going through the last of his belongings, donating what we could, keeping what mattered. We laughed more than I expected, telling stories, imitating his voice, celebrating the man he had been. Grief and joy existed together, I realized. They weren't opposites, they were two sides of the same love. Before she left, we stood together in his empty living room. The house was sold, the belongings distributed, the chapter officially closed. I felt a pang of sadness, but also something like relief. We had done everything we could. We had honored him, preserved him, carried him forward. Now it was time to let the house go and hold on to what remained. Driving home that night, I thought about the document, the healthcare proxy he had signed when his mind was still clear. He had chosen me. Through all the confusion, all the forgetting, all the moments when he didn't know my face, that choice had remained. It was proof that love could outlast memory, that trust could survive the loss of everything else. I still visit his grave sometimes, bringing flowers, bringing stories, bringing the quiet presence he taught me to offer. I tell him about my life, about Linda, about the memories that still surface when I least expect them. I don't know if he can hear me, but I believe he can feel me there. And in the end, that's what matters most. Not being remembered, but being loved.